Hi everyone, this is Mason Christensen, archivist at the Dearborn Historical Museum. Today I'm going to be delivering a lecture on the early landscape of the city of Dearborn, what early settlers to the city would have experienced in coming here in the early 1800s. I'm going to talk about everything from the plants, the geology, even just some of the rivers that people saw, a little bit about animals, aspects like that. Before I dig too much into material, I wanted to discuss really the sources that I'm using. One big source is really general land office surveys done around 1817, 1818 in the Dearborn area. In general, when they're mapping out the state, they're covering all sorts of details from the topography to the vegetation and writing huge amounts of details down. Conveniently for the Detroit area, there was a surveyor, Bella Hubbard, who did a detailed series of maps using that information, but also laying it down upon a more detailed map of the area, really from around the 1840s and 1850s. So the image I have showing here is Springwells Township, the map that was done by Bella Hubbard. In addition to that, I'm going to be using a lot of information from USGS and other geologic studies done about 100 years ago. There's information from a few studies done by a Wayne State professor about 10 years ago. There's a lot of details that I'm getting from early accounts that were used in like Farmer's History of Detroit in the 1880s. And even some information I'm using is coming from William Nowlan's famous bar-covered house. To begin the story of Dearborn's landscape, we have to go back over 10,000 years ago to the end of the last ice age. As glaciers were retreating at the end of the last ice age, they left behind all sorts of debris. You had water left behind that basically formed the predecessors to today's Great Lakes. And as the ice continues to retreat and these water bodies move and evolve, they're leaving behind all sorts of debris, but also as these lakes are continuing to exist at different points, in different areas, they're leaving behind shoreline remnants. And really, when you look around Dearborn and Detroit today, the dominant topographic remnants that you're seeing are leftovers of these Great Lakes predecessors. At the end of the last ice age, the predecessor to Lake Erie was at a much higher elevation than the current lake. As a result, it really covered much of the Detroit area. So as ice retreated further north, the lake was able to cover more area and really have different outlets for its water to go. As a result, it dropped in elevation, and the various stages of elevation for the lake have been given different names by geologists. The highest water level stage was called Lake Maumee, but there's also Lake Whittlesea, there's Lake Warren, there's Lake Wayne, and the one that really affects Dearborn is Lake Lundy. There was actually two different stages for that. There was the Grassmere stage, which was slightly higher in elevation, and then there's the Elkton stage. I know it's a lot of names that get really tongue-tied over, but these are important because they really, the various stages of the lake explain why you're seeing different ridges in different parts of the Detroit area. This little diagram shows just kind of as the lake retreats, it means that you just get more and more different beach ridges across the Detroit area. Before I discuss Lake Lundy on this slide, I wanted to mention the other big feature showing on it, which is the Detroit Moraine. Basically, the Detroit Moraine was a sediment deposit as the glaciers were retreating through the Detroit area. And the end result of this is because thanks to the Detroit Moraine, it left a fairly solid spot for settling, and it really is a big reason why Detroit was founded where it was in 1701. Getting back to the Lake Lundy or Elkton stage of Lake Erie, this map by Wayne State professor Jeffrey Howard shows that the shoreline of that lake really cut through much of what is now West Dearborn. It's going by the high ground over there at Northview Cemetery. It's cutting south then into downtown West Dearborn. Really, the high ground where the Dearborn Historical Museum is basically part of the shoreline. And downtown West Dearborn in general is really on high ground left over by the shoreline. Really, when Joshua Howard is picking Dearborn as a site of a military base, he's picking Dearborn as a location because it's relatively elevated thanks to this shoreline. So the shoreline continues, goes down through the Ford Homes area, really follows a stretch of Madison Street where it's fairly clear to find, and then from there continues southward, roughly near Party Street into Taylor. This other map done by Jeffrey Howard of Wayne State shows the shoreline of Lake Lundy or Elton continuing southward through the Taylor area. And it's interesting in regards to Taylor history because many features like Sand Hill Cemetery, there's a spot known as Indian Hill, which was an Indian mound, really the first main road through Taylor, Party Street, they're basically running along this shoreline. And so it has an impact, the shoreline has an impact not just upon Dearborn history, but even upon neighboring towns as well. Going back to Dearborn, I really love this LiDAR imagery of the West Dearborn area because it shows the definite shoreline of Lake Lundy or Elkton, but it also shows really beach ridges left behind by different stages of the lake. I mean, it wasn't the predecessor to Lake Erie didn't all retreat at once in like massive stages, that you had shorter, briefer periods at different elevation points that left behind beach sands in different parts of town. And it's really a big reason why you're finding so much sand, especially in West Dearborn overall, because of this kind of uneven, neat retreat of the lake. Because their topography hasn't really been altered in over 100 years, cemeteries like Northview and Dearborn and Union Chapel over in Inkster are really some of the best places to observe this sort of beach ridge topography around the Dearborn area. Otherwise, really, to get a better sense of it, you have to look at historical photos, like an image in our collection showing the area near Warren and Greenfield. So, as glaciers continue to retreat from the Great Lakes region, this opened new avenues for water to go. Suddenly you had the Niagara River that just suddenly opened up and as a route for water to go, and this meant that Lake Erie's predecessor, Lake Elkton, could suddenly flow in that direction, and that led to a very rapid drop of water. What you had left behind in the Dearborn area was really a few small bodies of water. We don't really know where their outlets were, but we know on the east side of the city you had Lake Rouge. That was really the main body of water left behind in the Dearborn area. Its shoreline was really, toward the, covering the south end of the city. Basically, we think, where Bobby Creek used to flow on the border of Dearborn and Detroit was basically the shoreline of Lake Rouge. There's a few other real, high spots in that area that were part of what we believe is the shoreline. This really, the shoreline left behind by this lake really made it so that a lot of the land along the Rouge River in general was somewhat more elevated than some other areas, and really made it so traveling along the Rouge was a better, road than many other areas in the city. Now that I've discussed topography of the Dearborn area a bit, I wanted to discuss more about soil types in the area. In general, the map I have on display here is very, very, very complicated looking, and I've learned from researching this that there are millions of soil types in this area. In general, though, when you look at the specific soil types in detail, really you find that it's, in the end, it's basically sand and clay and some other effects brought on by human development. Most of them are really just, it varies more about where each the sand layer is, where the clay is in general. This, for example, is just the soil type underneath the Ford Homes neighborhood. You see there's loam in there, which is basically a mixture of sand, clay, and a little bit of biological material. There's a solid layer of clay in there. There's sand. It's pretty straightforward. Clay really is a dominant soil feature all around Metro Detroit. The various stages of Lake Erie retreating really left behind tons of sediments that over time compacted into big layers of clay. The end result is that all around the area you had roads going through this clay soil that were truly terrible. You had it so that like any carriages, any cars and the like that are trying to make progress getting out of the city center of Detroit into the suburbs are just getting really bogged down anytime that there's wet weather. The end result of this is by the early 1900s, when the Wayne County Road Commission is formed, they make it a much higher priority to pave roads. And it's a big reason why the Wayne County Road Commission is one of the first organizations in the US paving large stretches of highway, because they're really that much motivated by having really some of the worst clay to drive in anywhere in the country. While clay developed all over Metro Detroit as a result of the lakes at the end of the last ice age, eastern Dearborn is really where some of the most commercially desirable clay developed. And this is because really that area was under glacial lakes for so long. The end result is that basically you have, till that is deposited for longer, it means you end up having bigger layers of clay that developed. And because you have wave action going on there for much longer, it really helps remove some of the waste sediments and waste debris that otherwise contaminates clay layers in the rest of the area. Because of this, you had dozens of brick-making firms that really established in this area from the late 1700s on, really in eastern Dearborn and in the Delray area of Detroit. And they find it easy going there because the clay is so high quality. The image I have here in this shows a steam shovel used by the Clipper Company, but it's really a surprisingly large number of companies that make money in this area from this clay. Moving on to vegetation, oak trees really dominated the landscape of West Dearborn. There was enough oak trees in the area that you had nearby communities such as Oakwood, really reflecting that fact. Oakwood is actually a village that popped up kind of near what is now the Marathon oil refinery plant, and it's really marketing the fact that it has this kind of peaceful oak tree landscape going on. Over on East Dearborn, you had a lot of maple and beech tree forest in the area of around what is now Michigan and Schaefer Road. You had a lot of kind of swamp vegetation going on in that area. In general, a lot of the early traffic in the Dearborn area followed the Rouge River rather than Michigan Avenue because they had to worry about swamps kind of in that Michigan and Schaefer area. Bella Hubbard's early maps of the Detroit area really show that oak trees could be found in West Dearborn mostly in settings referred to as oak openings. Oak openings were basically savannas. You had areas that are semi-prairie like, but with oak trees that were widely scattered about in general. I have some more images here of what oak opening landscapes look like. As you can see, sandy soils are definitely a part of what makes up a oak opening. Here in southeast Michigan and nearby in Ohio, they're basically found in these areas along the ancient beach ridges that used to be the shoreline of Lake Erie. The images I have here are actually from one of my favorite hiking parks, this place called Oak Openings Metro Park. It's just outside of Toledo. You look at these images here, they're basically areas of the park where the Toledo Metro Parks are basically trying to restore the oak opening landscape to give everybody a better sense of what it looked like. In general, oak opening landscapes are definitely hard to find because as soon as anybody came upon them, they cut down the trees, they messed with the landscape, they turned it into farmland whatsoever. So in general, there's not a lot of areas where you're seeing oak opening landscapes. Oak Openings Metro Park is actually situated along the old shoreline of Lake Warren, which would have actually continued north into what is now the Canton and Westland areas. Even in the Canton and Westland areas, there were also oak openings along the old shoreline. So what you're seeing there is very reflective of what southeast Michigan, especially here in Dearborn and over in Westland, would have looked like, 200 years ago. In addition to oak openings, there was just straight up prairies in the area. Just over the city line into Detroit, there was an area that was described as Prairie Ronde around the area of Michigan Avenue and Livernois that shows up on several maps. Looking in the Hubbard maps, the Bella Hubbard maps, down in Taylor, there's a number of areas that are specifically mentioned as prairie. When I was doing research for this presentation, one thing I also found fascinating for prairies was a news article from 1823 in the Detroit Gazette that mentions that Detroiters would regularly see prairie fires. And in this case, they specifically saw one, south from the city. At first, people thought it was actually in the Windsor area, but apparently, they were just kind of fooled by the bend of the river and basically realized that this fire was kind of off to the, more into the southwesterly direction. So this prairie fire that they're seeing is probably more in the Allen Park to Melvindale area. But what it is this is just truly evidence of, there being some fairly large prairies in the area and it being fairly possible that you could have some fairly large wildfires going on. Orchards are definitely something that shows up quite a bit on early Dearborn area maps. It's possible that these orchards were actually planted by the early French Canadian settlers in this area, but unfortunately we can't say that for certain. What's striking, though, in doing research for this talk is all the descriptions that make Dearborn in the Detroit area really seem like an absolutely fantastic area for growing fruit. You have in Antoine Cadillac's early account of the Detroit area in 1702, he's mentioning seeing, plum trees, apple trees, mulberry trees. He's seeing grapes growing in the area. He's seeing chestnut trees growing in the area. He's even mentioning cherry trees. And, he's very positive about this area. There's a book that came out recently, about a year or two ago, called Fruits of Perseverance that talks about how the French settlers in this area were relatively positive about the landscape, and they realized that the landscape around here was far less harsh than around Quebec or Montreal. And so they brought a lot of the fruits that they had growing up there down here, and there was a lot of fairly splendid results from it, because this is a lot more forgiving a landscape than Quebec is. Apple and peach trees were fairly commonly planted throughout the Detroit area in the 1800s and 1700s. But one species I wanted to mention as well is, something called the Jesuit pear, which was actually planted by the early French settlers in the area. It's a species that's largely gone now. There's only a few trees, mostly on the Windsor side of the Canadian border, that survive. But you would have had some of these existing along the Rouge River as well, and they're a fairly distinctive tree worth mentioning. You really have to find any photos of it. You really have to dig back into some of the Detroit area archives, but a lot of people who were alive in the 1800s loved photographing them because they stood out more and were fairly dramatic trees in general. So now going from vegetation to animal life, basically imagine that any species that today is native to northern Michigan, it probably existed here in southeast Michigan back in the early 1800s. So things like elk, moose, bears, wolves, these are all in the area in the early 1800s. You have bears being spotted on Detroit streets as late as 1834. Here in the Dearborn area, you have the book The Bar Covered House that talks about the Nowlands having to shoot a bear at one point in the 1830s. So like bears are a surprisingly common occurrence, and especially if you're getting into the late 1830s, the population density of the area is low enough that it's possible that bears could have lived here in fairly decent numbers. Especially by that point, when you're talking 1830s, outside of Detroit itself, the population density of much of the state is pretty low. It's also kind of fascinating that in the 1820s that Wayne County was actually paying bounties for the killing of wolves, which is something that you would not exactly expect today. So for the final section of this lecture, I wanted to discuss some of the prominent water features in this area. Really, one of the most prominent is probably the natural springs that existed near Fort Wayne that were responsible for giving the name Springwells to Springwells Township and what became the city of Springwells, later Fordson. But at the same time, this map that I have on this slide also shows that there were similar springs in swampy areas near the intersection of Michigan and Schaefer in the eastern portion of what is now Dearborn, which makes the name Springwells relatively fitting for the area. One interesting watery feature that I found on several Dearborn area maps were salt licks or salt springs. Basically, these are natural deposits of salt in watery areas above ground that are going to be areas where especially animals would flock to get the nutrient benefits of them. Early settlers in the area are going to see these, and they're going to be fairly noticeable just by how many animals are flocking to these areas. In general, I found it quite difficult to try to find an image that visualizes this. I had to go to like an Alberta biological report to even obtain the image that I'm using in this slide. Because it was quite difficult to try to find one that really represented something that you might have seen in the Dearborn area. So now I want to get into talking more about the River Rouge and its various tributaries. Basically, until the 1880s, the River Rouge was largely unaltered. It just kind of carried on, bringing in water from the highlands off to the west and beyond where the ancestors of Lake Erie used to sit. It's in 1888 things start changing. You have a canal that's dug, creating what is now Zug Island at the mouth of the river. But for the most part, into the early 20th century, it's a relatively unaltered stream. It's still fairly quiet. You have in the Delray area, you start having industry developing in the late 1880s into the 1890s. It starts affecting its appearance. It really takes the construction of the Ford Rouge plant starting in the late 1910s to make a dramatic impact upon the River Rouge. First of all, you have a new channel that's established around what is now Fordson Island, thereby creating Fordson Island. There are creeks that are basically eliminated with the construction of the Ford Rouge plant in general. And all this results in a large number of different changes to the river itself. With the construction of the Ford Rouge plant, you start having a number of streams being altered or eliminated in the Dearborn area. I really love this particular map because it shows off many of these sort of streams that are now basically eliminated in Dearborn or in Detroit. This shows a number of great streams like Bobby Creek, Roulo Creek, or in Detroit, Connors Creek. The two main tributaries I want to focus in this lecture on here in Dearborn are Roulo Creek and Bobby Creek. There's also Campbell Creek as well, but that was basically a tributary of Bobby Creek. Roulo Creek was located where the Ford Rouge plant ship turning basin is now. Basically, to create that ship turning basin, they just widened the route of the creek. So the creek was actually named after the Roulo family, who were some of the earliest residents in the area. At one point, there was even a shipyard on that creek. The Roulos themselves, I believe, operated a grist mill there. After construction of the Rouge plant, Rouleau Creek was eventually converted into a sewer. Unfortunately, most of the pictures I can find of the creek really show it as a sewer outlet in the Rouge plant area. Even as a sewer, unfortunately, it didn't really last that long. The sewer was decommissioned in favor of other sewer routes, and now really there's nothing really resembling the creek's route anymore. Most of the water just goes via different sewer pipes. I could really only find one image showing the natural flow of Rouleau Creek, and that's this image showing flooding on the creek in the Warren Avenue area in the 1910s. This image here actually shows the former location of Bobby Creek, another tributary of the Rouge that used to exist. Bobby Creek was actually named after the Bobby family, who were early French Canadian landowners in the area. They actually obtained land in what is now the south end of Dearborn, thanks to a treaty with the Potawatomi Indians in the area. They gave them title to the area. And into the early 1800s, they were actually making money via renting land and selling land in the area. They ended up at, thanks to this area becoming part of the U.S. and eventually the War of 1812, they pretty much divested themselves from the area and moving over to Windsor and eventually Toronto. Like Rouleau Creek, Bobby Creek also served as a shipyard in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Until the early 1900s, it was fairly peaceful and idyllic. And as a result, it served as a nice backdrop for locating Woodmere Cemetery in that area. Unfortunately, when you get into the late 1910s into the early 1920s, the industrial development in the area really takes its toll on the creek. You have around 1921, if I remember right, you had sewers that were constructed from north in Detroit and Highland Park that dumped their contents into Bobby Creek and then from that into the Rouge. A lot of the contents of that were coming from the newly created Fort Highland Park plant. So very quickly you had complaints of Bobby Creek being heavily polluted by even 1923, 1924. By that point, Bobby Creek was already a toxic mess. And for decades, Bobby Creek remained an open sewer. And it's a bit disturbing to think that you had an open sewer running by the South End neighborhood of Dearborn for decades until about 1961 when things finally changed when they actually enclosed the creek and turned it into an enclosed sewer. To this day, Bobby Creek is actually still an operating sewer in the area. That's why you're still over at Woodmere Cemetery, you're able to access that area and walk right above where the sewer is. Going back to the main River Rouge, this image from the 1910s was taken near the Dearborn Historical Museum looking east and basically would have been shot where the westbound lanes of Michigan Avenue are now. Literally, the channel of the Rouge in this image would now be the site of the westbound lanes of Michigan Avenue. Before 1967, Michigan Avenue did a dangerous curve around the Rouge River just east of the museum that was frequently named Dead Man's Curve. And this spot was leading to a large number of car accidents on Michigan Avenue. Eventually, it was decided that the Rouge really needed to be rerouted further north to allow for more room to eliminate that curve and also just widen Michigan Avenue in the downtown West Dearborn area. So in 1967, that was finally fixed, and we really approached our current alignment of Michigan Avenue at that point. The other big project on the Rouge River near the downtown West Dearborn area that was done was really the channelizing and straightening of the river south of Michigan Avenue during the 1970s. The Army Corps of Engineers basically, carved through, buried the river briefly, carved through a straight channel, put concrete walls on the side of the river to try to increase the flow of the river and make it so the river was less of a flood danger for the city overall. On the map that I have here is done by the USGS, and you could see the newly created route of the Rouge River, but you can also see the bends of the previously existing route of the Rouge. Unfortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers obliterated a fairly peaceful and natural landscape along the River Rouge south of Michigan Avenue in the 1970s. This image from 1972 really shows that you would have had a fairly nice wetland ecosystem going on in the area, probably not dramatically altered from decades in the past. So this pretty much concludes my lecture. I have some key dates for everybody's reference on this slide, but if anybody has any questions about anything I've talked about, feel free to email me at mchristensen@ci.dearborn.mi.us or just send me a message on Facebook.